class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 3 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Anaheim Ducks and lost by a score of 3-2. As per usual, the preseason results don't matter, the score doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. But this is the first time in the preseason that the shoe is actually on the other foot for the San Jose Sharks, because their first two games here have been at home, and so they have been incentivized to actually ice at least a semi-competitive NHL roster. And so that's why you've seen players like Smith and Toffoli and Skinner and Misa and Dickinson all get into game action across those first two games, and why you have seen the Vegas Golden Knights, the road team on both of those occasions, ice basically an AHL level roster. Here tonight, the Sharks are playing their first road preseason game, and as such, they don't really need to try and sell tickets in any which way, and so they can ice a roster that is much closer to what you would expect from the San Jose Barracuda compared to the Anaheim Ducks, who come out here with what is almost an actual full-on NHL roster. They got Killorn and Granlund and Kreider and Terry and Gauthier and Carlson all throughout their lineup. There's maybe like 2 or 3 NHL regulars, like Mason McTavish is missing here because he only just recently signed his contract, but this is quite close to what you will see the Ducks have on the first game of the regular season for themselves. So there was a very, very steep difference in terms of talent level from both of these rosters, and yet the score actually remains rather close. This is kind of just like a consequence of preseason hockey. If this were a regular season game with some real stakes, you could imagine that the Ducks would really run up the score here tonight, but because it is preseason, and for a lot of the more veteran guys that I mentioned, this is a pretty irrelevant game for them, it ends up actually still remaining pretty close, which was, I guess, somewhat nice to see. First period comes along, it is 0-0 after 20 minutes. Then in the second period, the Ducks do begin to really take control of this game with 3 goals in less than 3 minutes, but the Sharks do stop that parade of goals for them with a goal from Regenda to make it 3-1 on the power play. And then late in the third period, it is Gaudette who manages to bring this game to within 1. So we do get some 6-on-5 play time after that, but the Sharks never really come all that close to tying this game. And so that is the final score, 3-2. When it comes to the roster that the Sharks had, as I mentioned, not a particularly competitive one that you would probably see from the San Jose Barracuda. Only a couple of these players in this lineup who would you expect to actually be on the starting roster for the Sharks in about a week's time. And there is also a pretty different set of groups when it comes to this lineup of players. There is one group of players who are not really remotely close to being in the NHL. These are guys who were brought in to be AHL players. That's where they are going to remain for the entirety of this next season, but it is kind of like a courtesy almost to have been able to give them this one preseason game. I imagine, despite the fact that the Sharks actually will have a pretty quick turnaround here, the quickest turnaround of the preseason thus far, they do play again on Wednesday, and so Tuesday is their day off in between. I would not be surprised if we see a bunch of players end up getting sent down tomorrow, including many of the players who ended up playing here tonight. So this group includes guys like LeBerge or Olosin, Shane Bowers, Oliver Wahlstrom, probably like Kasper Halttunen as well, Hache, Clayton, these types of AHL guys who do get into some action here, but we're never really going to be making the NHL roster at all. Another group of players here tonight are players who could end up getting sent down, but had the opportunity here tonight to show why they should be kept around for perhaps an extra game or an extra couple of games, or maybe even have an outside shot of making it into the NHL roster. This goes for players like Afanasyev, Ostapchuk, Cardwell, a very real shot to see what they can actually do in this type of situation. So it was a lineup that I wouldn't say is the most exciting coming into this game, but there were still some question marks throughout. Let us start off with the top line now when it comes to a player-by-player basis. Now, it should be noted that there was a kind of lot of shuffling, especially within the top 9 for the Sharks here tonight. Players were played in different areas throughout this game. This was likely due to a good amount of power plays and penalty kill, a lot of special teams being involved, and so there wasn't a lot of kind of strict 5-on-5 play for a long period of time, but still, it should be noted that there were a lot of player movements throughout this game. So on this first line, let's start off with Kurashev. He was basically the only true NHL forward, someone who you could bet would be on the Sharks starting roster come this next season. So he ends up playing okay. I would say he didn't necessarily have the puck a ton here tonight, so he didn't actually get to show off a lot. But when he did, he was usually able to make some pretty decent plays. So we did get to see some skill being shown off by Kurashev, kind of reminiscent to the first preseason game that he got, that he is a player who's probably not going to be much of a play driver himself. He's not going to be someone who you expect to take over a game for his line, but someone who does look like he can be a very good complement to some other really great players. It's exactly the type of role that he served with the Chicago Blackhawks, and that is likely to continue here with the San Jose Sharks. So an all right game for Kurashev. He was flanked by Kasper Halttunen, who I don't actually think had all that great of a night. Not a particularly noticeable game at all for Kasper Halttunen. This was, as I mentioned, an opportunity perhaps for him to maybe attempt to stick around, and it feels as though he failed that opportunity, and so he'll likely be sent down if indeed what I'm saying is correct, and that we'll see a bunch of players end up getting sent down tomorrow. I suspect Halttunen will end up being one of them. Could definitely use the extra bit of seasoning here in a full first season at the professional level with the San Jose Barracuda. And then when it comes to the other winger on this line, we do have Afanasyev, who just like back in that first preseason game that he played about a week ago, we did get to see a lot of energy out of Afanasyev. You can tell that he came in here as a man on a mission, trying to be able to make this NHL roster. I don't think he had quite as much success here tonight as he did last week. That is likely more so because of the fact that the Sharks were usually on the back foot here tonight against a much more skilled Anaheim Ducks squad than when the Sharks played Vegas last week. But still, Afanasyev, there were some good things, but maybe not super consistent. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, here is where we have Ty Dellandrea. Now, there is no secret that I have been extremely critical of Ty Dellandrea. If we go back to the preseason game from a few days ago, Dellandrea was not remotely good. And then, of course, if we go back to last season, he scored 1 goal in over 70 games, and then defensively was also kind of terrible. And so Dellandrea has been a player who I have been constantly talking about as a waiver option here for the San Jose Sharks, someone who should be leapfrogged by other younger, more promising players who could even offer a better level of play currently in the present. And yet, despite all of these factors, you do have to give credit where credit is due, and Ty Dellandrea not only had a good game here tonight, but was probably the Sharks' best forward across these 60 minutes. In particular, in the first period, I thought he was by far the Sharks' best player. Like his second, third, fourth, fifth shift of the game, he was just all over the ice. And I'm not just talking about him coming in with some energy and throwing the body. Oh, wow, he accumulates, 4 or 5 hits in a game. Congratulations. But he was actually showcasing not just some better defensive ability, where he was actually having an active stick and breaking up plays, but also some offensive creativity as well. He was deking players out. He was trying to dangle them. There were actually some aspects that we were seeing from Dellandrea that were signs of why he was a first-round pick a few years ago of the Dallas Stars. Now, is this something that we can expect to see consistently? Almost certainly not, but this was definitely the type of game that he needed to have to really keep himself in the running for a roster spot on this San Jose Sharks team. And honestly, I suspect that Ryan Warsofsky is looking for, and Mike Greer as well, is looking for every possible reason to try and keep Ty Dellandrea around. And so this game does end up going a long way. But as I mentioned here, this is not just going to be a single hurdle that Dellandrea needs to get over. It's not as though if he cracks the NHL roster for game 1 that he's perfectly safe and will stay for the rest of the season. He has to put up efforts like this pretty much game in and game out, because there are tons of players on the San Jose Barracuda, or tons of players who will be on the San Jose Barracuda, who will be knocking on the door trying to take this lineup spot. Guys like who we saw tonight, Ethan Cardwell or Igor Afanasyev, other names on top of that who will be looking to try and grab this spot from Dellandrea. So if he does manage to make it to the NHL, and this game does certainly help him out in that respect, you will have to see more of what we got from Dellandrea here tonight and less of what we have seen from him time and time again over this past season. So we'll see what ends up happening, but this was definitely a fantastic night for Dellandrea. Dellandrea. He was the Sharks' best forward, as I said. When it comes to the two other players here, we have on the other wing, Pavel Regenda, who pretty much every single time that we see Regenda play, not just with the Sharks, but with the Barracuda, he does seem to impress. You go back to last preseason game, you go back to last year's playoffs with the Barracuda, where he was one of their better forwards. You go back to the regular season with the Barracuda, where he was still playing quite well. He constantly gives you a solid effort game in and game out. There is a reason for why he was brought back on a new contract for this season. There has been a significant amount of roster turnover, not just with the Sharks, but with the Barracuda over these last few seasons. The fact that Regenda had managed to survive that and remain with the organization, it does show that they have a lot of trust in him. I thought Regenda was one of the Sharks' better forwards here tonight. He did score a goal, not exactly the most skilled goal, as it just so happens to deflect off of his skate, but still, it is nice to be able to get on the board there. And generally, I thought Regenda played very solid game. When it comes to the center on this line, we do have Zach Ostapchuk, kind of similar in a way to Kurashev, but though obviously to a lesser extent. Ostapchuk didn't really seem to get a ton of puck touches here tonight, but when he did, he was usually managing to make some decent plays with it. Not particularly high-skilled like Kurashev, but the fact is that things were usually going his way. I felt that when he was on the ice, so not a great game for Ostapchuk, but it was all right. Is this really enough to get him onto the NHL roster? Probably not. I wouldn't be too surprised to see him get sent down. Maybe they'll give him a little bit more leeway, but he may very well end up starting this year with the Barracuda. When it comes to the third line now, first we have Sam Laberge. He was probably he ends up playing the least amount of ice time in this game, and it showed on the ice. He had very, very little impact here tonight. Didn't really notice him all that much. There was maybe one or two shifts where he was able to make his physical presence known by throwing a couple of hits. But as I mentioned earlier on with Dellandrea, it's nice to be a physical player, but you do have to contribute in other ways, and Laberge didn't really manage to do that here tonight. I also said earlier on that he was part of that group of guys who were just getting this game as a courtesy before being sent down to the AHL. That's exactly what's going to happen. Then we have Adam Gaudette. Now, Gaudette did need to redeem himself, just as Dellandrea needed to, after the previous game where he was quite bad as part of that Gaudette-Dellandrea-Goodrow line. And I do think Gaudette had managed to pull that one off here tonight. He wasn't spectacular or anything, but I do think he was a good bit better. He did manage to score, and this was a pretty nice shot. Seeing some of those reasons for why he was a 19-goal scorer this past season. So pretty good outing for Gaudette. And then we have Ethan Cardwell. So he was coming off of his, great preseason performance in that previous game where he was like a top 3, top 2 player for the San Jose Sharks that particular night. Didn't quite manage to follow up on that. Perhaps that shouldn't be that much of a surprise. In the previous game, Cardwell got to play with Wenberg and Musty and Eklund, and he was really getting some strong offensive support. And here tonight, it's not as though that, like I said, Gaudette played a pretty good game, and there was enough lineup shuffling that Cardwell didn't just get stuck to Laberge for 15 minutes here tonight or anything like that. But obviously, there's less offensive support, and there's going to be less chances that occur because of that. Cardwell, I thought, defensively did some pretty good things. Offensively, had maybe 1 or 2 moments where I thought he was quite good. On the power play, he had some decent chances, but generally it was a slight fall off from that previous one. Still does keep him in the running for sure for a possible NHL lineup spot. I don't think Cardwell will be sent down tomorrow, though we shall see. He's a player who I think can stick around. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Lawson, Bowers, Wallstrom. None of these players really stood out in that much of a positive light. It felt as though pretty much every single time that they were on the ice, the shift was in the defensive zone, constantly having to be on that back foot. Yes, you could look at, for instance, the play of Shane Bowers on this Adam Gaudette goal where he makes a good defensive play at the blue line, which gets this puck going the other way and eventually ends up with that goal for San Jose. But the fact is that Bowers, just because you have, a full-on 1-minute defensive zone shift where you're having to constantly be wary of being able to give up a goal against, and then you make one hero play to get the puck out, that doesn't necessarily mean that you had a good game, especially when there's like 10 different shifts where you are constantly having to defend. It's very similar to, what we saw from Barclay Goodrow this past season. If you lay out to block a shot, it's nice, but if you're forced to have to do this pretty much every single time because you are not a positive possession player, it usually means that you're kind of a net negative for the team. That's kind of what this felt like for this entire fourth line. And so these are all three players who I think will definitely end up getting sent down. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we have the Sharks' top pairing of Desharnais with Cagnoni. And let us start off with Cagnoni, because I mentioned that Ty Dellandrea was probably the Sharks' best forward here tonight. I would say that Cagnoni was definitely the Sharks' best defenseman, and if we were to take just the best skater in general, I would say Cagnoni does have the edge. He had an extremely impressive night here in this game. I thought offensively we saw a good amount of creativity. We saw him be able to use his skating ability to get around guys a few times. Defensively, I thought he made some really solid plays. Yes, there were a couple of issues here or there. That's to be expected, especially in a game where the Sharks are so overwhelmingly outmatched skill-wise. Like, if you're constantly having to defend waves of players like Terry and Killorn and Carlson, all these different high-level, high-skill players, even if they're not playing at 100%, when they have the puck, they usually want to make a play, and so you have to show up defensively, and I thought Cagnoni did this much more often than not. If I'm being honest, if this were a true meritocracy here for this Sharks defensive core, and there were no other outside factors influencing anything, no decision based on waivers or chemistry or composition or anything of that nature, and you were just looking for who are the best, let's say, 7 defensemen that the Sharks have on the roster currently, I do think that Cagnoni does find himself in that top 7. Like, there's a world where he could actually start this year in the NHL. I don't think it's actually going to happen because of the aforementioned issues with all of the other NHL kind of guys. But like, if you ask me right now to choose between Nick Leddy and Luca Cagnoni, I'm probably taking Luca Cagnoni. In the one preseason game that I saw from Nick Leddy, and then looking at his actual stats, like, there's nothing really impressive there. And so this is a player who constantly does show up in a very, very positive light. It's probably not going to pan out to NHL time this season, or at least not consistent NHL time this season, but continues to always be super promising every single time that we see him. So again, he is definitely someone who we'll probably see until pretty much the last game of the preseason, if I had to guess at the very least. His defensive partner, on the other hand, Desharnais, not a great showing. If we go back to actually his first preseason game when he was paired with Sam Dickinson, he looked quite good and gave himself a good kind of chance of being in the Sharks' top 6 to begin the year. Here tonight, he kind of walks that back. It was, I should note, a very tough game for the Sharks defense, because it is not just about the 2 players on the ice who played this defensive position. You do have to defend as a team, as a 5-man unit, and the forwards in front looked pretty out of sync at times. And so when you don't have that support, especially when you are a defensive defenseman like Desharnais, who's not just going to carry this puck out of the zone himself like his defensive partner Cagnoni is very much capable of, you do have a harder time of being able to make a positive impact. But even then, it did feel as though some of the plays with the puck were a lot more sloppy than what we are usually expecting from Desharnais, which was somewhat of a surprise as well as a disappointment. So not a great outing for him. When it comes to the Sharks' second pairing, here we have Shakir Mukhamadullin, who I think kind of had a bit of a coin flip style of game. Some shifts, he'd hit heads and he would look really, really solid. And then some shifts, he'd hit tails and it would look a good bit worse. So some issues with consistency, I would say, from Mukhamadullin here tonight. That is not necessarily that much of a surprise. As I mentioned, the Ducks did bring a really skilled roster here tonight. The Sharks did not bring a really skilled roster. And so you can see the impact of how having weaker forwards in front can affect your defensive game just by looking at this second goal from the Anaheim Ducks by Radko Gudas. This is a play where Mukhamadullin is coming down the wall. It looks like he has a step on his man, on the Ducks player, that he's going to be able to get this puck and just be able to clear it out or pass it away to somebody else. But he ends up getting double teamed, which is fine because the Sharks do have the backup of Shane Bowers, the center in this position, to support him in this spot. And if this were, Celebrini, if this were like a really skilled center, you're probably able to clean this play up very easily. But Shane Bowers ends up overskating in this situation, not doing a particularly good job. And so Mukhamadullin loses the 2-on-1 battle here, and that causes this puck to squeak out, comes to Gudas for this goal that makes it 2-0. I don't really put that much blame onto Mukhamadullin in that particular situation, despite the fact that it comes right off of his stick and into the back of the net within just a couple of seconds. So generally, roller coaster of a game here for Mukhamadullin, sometimes really good, sometimes less so, but you could kind of take the more so look on the positive side with him, because he did have to defend some pretty tough players. When it comes to his defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, it's kind of a similar situation, but a bit more streamlined, I would say. The first 30 minutes of this game for Liljegren was absolutely awful. Like, he was the worst defenseman on the ice for the Sharks in the first 30 minutes of this game. Just tons and tons of mistakes where he's challenging players and just getting absolutely walked, creating these odd man rushes for the Anaheim Ducks. He's passing the puck to absolutely nobody. Just both offensively and defensively, he was having a huge negative impact on the game. And yet, suddenly, at around that halfway mark, or within that around that time, things just completely turned around. Liljegren actually played a really solid third period in this game. All in all, it averages out to what is probably not that great of a game in the end for Liljegren. Like, you want to see more consistency. Like, it's one thing when it happens to Mukhamadullin, who has like 30 NHL games in his career, but for someone like Liljegren, where you are definitely looking more so for some stability, and you see him start off as poorly as you did, even though he did have a very strong finish, it's not super promising. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing here, we have Hache and Clayton. It was definitely a rough night. Hache, I do think, had some solid shifts where he was actually able to make some decent plays, but he was kind of dragged down a little bit by Clayton, who had a really, really rough outing here tonight. He was a player who I did mention earlier on as someone who was definitely going to be sent down to the Barracuda no matter what, but definitely not that final performance he wanted to have here in this preseason for the Sharks. Really rough night for him. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltending, we do have a split of this game. This is the first time this preseason that has happened. Nedeljkovic played the entirety of Game 1. Askarov played the entirety of Game 2. But we are now having what will perhaps be the tandem for the Barracuda this season. Skarek gets the first half of the game. Gabe Carrier gets the second half. Skarek ends up letting in all three of these goals here for the Sharks, while Carrier does manage to shut Anaheim out. But that doesn't really tell the full story of this game. These three goals that Skarek lets in, he doesn't really have that much of a chance on. Maybe the Gauthier one, he is able to make that save on, but this Gudas goal comes through traffic, and as I said, pretty bad giveaway from behind the net. And then also the Vetrano one is just way, way too easy for him to be able to put that one in. So Skarek kind of left out to dry over those three goals, and then the Ducks kind of just laid off a little bit after that, so Carrier didn't really have all that difficult of a time keeping Anaheim off the board for the rest of this game. We'll see what ends up happening when it comes to the Barracuda goaltending tandem. I have brought up in the past that someone like Matt Davis could end up making up that tandem with Carrier, and Skarek could be that third man, but based on the deployment for this particular game, maybe the Sharks are leaning that other way. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I said, on Wednesday. I've mentioned it multiple times in this video. I do suspect we will probably see a good amount of cuts tomorrow. Perhaps I'm completely off base, and a lot of what I've said in this video is going to end up being incorrect and inaccurate. But I suspect we'll probably see a good amount of changes going into that Wednesday game, especially since it is at home. The Sharks will probably end up having a much, much more competitive roster. Perhaps even we'll see Macklin Celebrini's first preseason game here with the San Jose Sharks, depending on how close he is, though based on what we have seen in practice, maybe that won't end up happening. But definitely a lot of different players will draw into the lineup, and we should have a slightly more clear view of what this Sharks starting lineup roster for October 9th, Game 1 of the regular season, might end up looking like. Class dismissed.